Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are Zooming in from. My name is Dr. Danielle McCamey, and I'm a proud member of the Women in Chest Medicine Interest Group, and I will be serving as your moderator for this conversation. Thank you all for joining us today for this virtual fireside chat with Maria Smilios and Miss Virginia Allen in honor of Women's History Month and World TB Day. As you may know, CHEST was founded in 1935 by tuberculosis survivors. So the story of tuberculosis in America and the Black Angels is a critical part of our history. Before we get started, we wanted to take a minute to thank Women in Chest Medicine Interest Group for making this event possible. So virtual hand clap. Women in Chest Medicine is dedicated to the professional development, the eradication of women's health disparities, and well-being in balance. In addition to virtual events like this, the Women in Chest Medicine Interest Group is also committed to the annual Women's Lung Health Disparities Research Grant, which funds research on important and timely issues related to women's lung health. If you'd like to support the grant and learn more about the interest group, we'll drop a link in the chat, so be on the lookout for that. So speaking of grants, quick plug for our CHEST Community Impact and CHEST research grants that are currently open, and we will be accepting submissions up until April 22nd. We'll also drop that link in the chat for you to learn more about our grant offering. So please apply, get this money. And finally, we are so thrilled to have Maria and Miss Virginia here today, and we're even more excited to welcome them to our annual meeting in Boston later this year. We can't share too many details with you now, but believe us when we say we have some very special things planned that you don't want to miss. Be sure that you come join us in Boston. The link will also be put in the chat. So without further ado, let's get our conversation going. So Miss Virginia, Maria, it's so good to be connected with you all again. How are you all doing?
We're good. Thank you for having us. Hello, everybody, wherever you are. Good afternoon. I hope everybody's having a nice day or a nice morning. I'm so happy to be here talking to all of you. For those who are on the screen, hello. For those off the screen, hello.
Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to join you today. I have a little cough, so I have my microphone off until I need to speak.
Thanks so much for welcoming everyone, Maria and Miss Virginia. So let's get into our conversation. So Miss Virginia, this question's for you. So please share with us what inspired you to go into nursing.
I was inspired by my aunt, who was a registered nurse, who lived here on Staten Island, not too far from where I live now. I live on the grounds of Seaview Hospital and Home, formerly the Tuberculosis Sanitarium. And that is where I started as a nurse's aide before I went to nursing school. So my aunt was my inspiration. I loved her dearly. She had beautiful white starched uniforms and caps and shiny shoes, and I used to help her shine her shoes after we cleaned them. And we lived not too far from the hospital. As a matter of fact, I used to walk to work. It's a long walk, but it's a beautiful walk.
Awesome. So can you share with us your aunt's name and her specialty in nursing?
Oh, Edna Sutton Ballard. Her specialty was recovery room nurse. in the operating room of the 5th floor here in the children's building. It's not used for that now, but at one time it was. And she came from Savannah, Georgia, to finish her nursing studies at Harlem Hospital in Harlem, New York. And she eventually came to Seaview Hospital in 1931, the year I was born.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing, Miss Virginia, and also just amplifying her work and saying her name. So speaking in the same vein of inspiration, Maria, please share with us, what inspired you to get into writing and how you stumbled upon the Black Angels.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. I was working as a science editor for Springer in 2015. I was editing a book on, as a matter of fact, it was rare lung diseases. And the chapter that I was editing, the doctor was going to try this new medication or something. And he made an allusion to that he hoped that it would have the same effect as like the cure for tuberculosis that was found at Seaview Hospital in Staten Island. As a native New Yorker, somebody who loves infectious disease, it was just kind of a thing that I just loved reading about infectious disease and how it moved through the city. I became curious and I Googled tuberculosis in Seaview Hospital, and up came the story of Seaview and the cure that was found there. But alongside of it was the story of Miss Virginia Allen, who belonged to this cadre of Black nurses called the Black Angels. And I thought, well, who are they? And after days and days of finding nothing, I finally was able to track down Miss Virginia, and we connected and we started talking. And eventually this incredible story started to unfold, a story that had lived in Staten Island as a kind of whitewashed, sentimentalized, anecdotal story of like, oh, hey, these Black nurses came up, took the place of white nurses who were leaving, and then helped with the cure. And that was the end of it. And I thought there has to be more to this. And so when I started to look at the history and the backdrop and what was happening at the time, and the nurses had no archives. It was all oral history. And once I was able to build that, Dr. Robichek's son is still alive. And so he provided me with all of this information that hadn't been public because his father was such a private figure. That really began to fill out the story. And then I got his trial notes and found the original trial patients. 3 of them were alive for the isoniazid trials at Seaview. And so they filled in the story. So that's how it really started. And I thought, this is an extraordinary story of like women who have been left out of science, a narrative that has been told completely from a male perspective. And as I say, of course, those men deserve those accolades, but so did the women who were on these front lines, administering the medication and watching these patients, these 92 patients every single day and taking notes, because it had never been tested on people. It was tested on some guinea pigs and mice at Hoffman LaRoche. So that's how I came to the story. It was through a line that I read that opened a Pandora's box into this history that took 8 years to write. It's extraordinary.
It is extraordinary. And just kind of keeping with you, Maria, just wanting to dig a little bit deeper about this Pandora's box that you got into. So what were some of the interesting things that came out, or things that you thought were interesting or unfair, or just if you could just dig a little bit more about that?
That is like hours and hours, but okay, so I don't have that, I'll condense it. I think some of the most fascinating things to come out of this was, number one, there are so many stories about women that have not been told. But more importantly, these women were not just working on these wards, they were also working during a time of Jim Crowism and the mythology that they were coming north into this promised land to work at a hospital that was one of 4 out of the 29 municipal hospitals that accepted Black patients, was shocking. As a New Yorker, we don't learn this history. We're never told this history. And so that to me was, wow, this was really incredible. The other part of it was what they left behind. Here are these women, they're presented with a choice. For example, Miss Virginia's aunt, Edna, she's in Savannah. She can't get a job working as a nurse because, as I say, the same lines that drew, same country that drew lines around water fountains and bus stations drew them around hospitals. 200 Black hospitals, that's the only place Black nurses were allowed to work versus 6,000 white ones. And so she's presented with this opportunity when the white nurses begin leaving and they recruit the Black nurses. They send out these advertisements. And she says, do I stay in the Jim Crow South with the signs and people dictating my life? Or do I come north and wager my life, on the whims of this disease that has no cure in a hospital where she later learns, and they all later learn, is actually not in New York City. It's on an island. It's a 5-hour commute round trip from Harlem where they live. It's considered a pest house. The people that are there are sent to die. They're all immigrants who are considered immoral and uncouth. And so when you begin to layer that narrative on top of just the narrative of tuberculosis itself, like as a disease and what it meant, the stigma, and then the xenophobia that they layered because they turned the microbe into a disease of poverty, that it was one of people who were poor. It couldn't have been, the tenements or the conditions that they were living. It had to be just because they were poor or immoral. The narrative just blew up. And so, it was that. And I mean, there's so many other things that maybe we could touch upon later, but that was really the bulk of, for me, like, how do you tell this story and really tell it where these women are centered, but not take away that race for the cure? And that's where that two narrative part came in, where the race for the cure is happening alongside these women who are the reason that it's happening, at least at Seaview. It's staying open because they are risking their lives.
And thank you for shedding more insight. And I think that's a good segue to you, Miss Virginia, to having had the experience on the inside, as Maria had layered kind of like the social things happening in the world on the outside. Can you share what that experience was? Like what were some of the conversations that were had amongst nursing staff? Like, did you all realize how dangerous it was and that you all were actually being instrumental parts of a historical moment?
I would say no, not for me. For the older nurses, I was only 16 when I started working at Seaview. A very unsophisticated, young. I related to the children I was caring for in the children's hospital. But I heard little stories as I got older about the racism and the behavior of the patients toward the nurses. But I had a positive experience, thank goodness.
Could you recount some of those positive experiences with us?
Well, I had patients these were children, mostly of the patients who were in the hospital. Due to their contact with their parents, they tested positive, so they were in the hospital for care. And I enjoyed working with them, especially a little boy named Willie, who was in a body cast. I'll never forget him. And we had to take at least an hour and a half to give him care in the morning, but he was getting care all during the day. Oh, you would walk away from his crib, and he was in a body cast from his chest to just below his knees. And he had a thirst for attention. So he dropped something on the floor, and of course you would pick it up for him and give it back to him. And he liked to talk. He was very talkative and pleasant. He was a very pleasant child. We had very few really sick patients on the floor. The children were not as ill as the adults. But we took them to school. We helped them with their homework. It was nice reading to them, taking them out to the solarium. Every ward had a porch that's called the solarium. So during the day, they would be outside, no matter what kind of weather it was. You dressed them appropriately and took them out for fresh air. They had a very rich diet. The food was excellent and lots of rest.
Thank you for sharing that. I remember going to the museum, and one of the highlights of the care of patients with tuberculosis is rest, fresh air, and light, and that a lot of the architecture went into creating that environment that was conducive to fresh air, light. So there was tons of balconies and open air spaces so that people at least had a pleasant environment despite them going through the disease process of tuberculosis.
And I must say, my living here, it's still a beautiful space, even though we have buildings that are deteriorated, because this is a landmark and they're not allowed to do any renovations unless they bring the buildings back to their original state. But the nurses' residence where I live, and I lived in 1948, I live here in one little room with a chest, a chair, a small closet, and a sink. Now I have about 7 of those rooms in my one-bedroom apartment. They did a beautiful job of renovating this space. It's beautiful, and the grounds are beautiful. And I must say, 2 women were the architects.
How appropriate for Women's History Month. Thank you.
Yes.
And I'm always so fascinated to hear that you came back to Seaview. Because I would think that it would just be kind of memories that you just wanted to leave behind, but, just curious to share what brought you back to Seaview.
Well, I like old buildings. I like antiques. My house is full of them. And this is a antiquated space. And it just appealed to me. I was living in PS 20, which was a school that had been renovated. After I sold my home, I moved into PS 20, and that was a beautiful space also. And when they did the ribbon cutting here, I was among the guests, and we took a tour. And I decided I should live here. So that's how I moved here.
Amazing. Thank you so much. So Maria, back to you. I want to just talk about Dr. Robichek. As you know, he was a member of the American College of Chest Physicians. So we're really excited to hear more about the uncovering of his work and the learning about him as a physician, as a scientist, and just really want to dig more into kind of as you were learning more about the work and the archives of the work.
Yeah, great. Thank you. His son is still alive. He's 81 years old. He was very close to his father. His father was an extremely private man, and despite all of the stuff that's written about him, very little is actually written about his private life and how he came to Seaview, why he came to Seaview, and why he did what he did. And I don't want to give too much away because we're going to be in Boston, but I'll give you a little bit of the landscape of what he was like. First of all, he worked at Seaview from when he graduated in 1939. He started off doing autopsies because he believed that the only way to understand tuberculosis was from the inside out. And he worked there for free all his life. He never got paid. people asked him why he did that. And he said, well, first of all, let me rewind. His father actually died of laryngeal tuberculosis when he was 16 years old. He suffered for 6 years, the dad. And Robichek was extremely close to his father. He was the only, he was basically his primary caretaker when he was sick. His father went to Saranac Lake. He got better, and then he relapsed with pulmonary tuberculosis. And they said to him, you can go back to Saranac Lake, or you could choose to die at home. And he chose to just live out his days at home. And it was this very long, drawn-out death that happened. It didn't come easy to him, and it was harrowing. And he was going to go into his family's business, which was a coal business. And then something happened when his father died in May of 1929. His son told me that my father was at home and he was mourning and grieving, and something shifted inside of him. He didn't understand it at the time, but it would move him towards becoming a physician and studying tuberculosis. At the same time, and this is where the story becomes very serendipitous, 3 months after his father dies, the nurses at Seaview begin quitting. And so it's this alignment of stars where these stories are almost like universally bound to cross, the story of Robichek and these Black nurses. So he goes to school, he graduates from Columbia Physicians and Surgeons, and he takes a job at Seaview. And he sees the disparities. He came from a wealthy family. His father was sent to Saranac Lake, and he says, my goodness, like, you have all of these people suffering and dying, and they're being sent to what was considered then a, quote, pest house. And he wanted to help them. And so he dedicated his life to trying to find a remedy. I talk about this in the book. His first wife died of a brain aneurysm. And he ended up remarrying, and he had to give up his kids because he couldn't work and take care of them. So he gave up his kids, and they went and lived with his mother in the Bronx. And he devoted his life to finding a cure. And he said, nobody should ever capitalize off of tuberculosis. Nobody should capitalize off disease, particularly tuberculosis. And so when you get to that cure moment in the book where you realize that nobody can patent isoniazid, for him, the son said to me, it was a celebratory moment. But the wonderful thing was he had his father's archives. And there are these like beautiful handwritten, it's what like we would do on an Excel spreadsheet. You know, this was the dawning of drug trials. I do want to preface, he got consent from every single patient. This was not any kind of like Dr. Mengele happening at Seaview or a Tuskegee thing. He did get consent. And I want to make that clear because some people, there's some misconceptions that he did not. He did. He was a very ethical man. He was horrified at what happened when the story broke. He was like, there is no cure. Now you cannot say there's a cure. It's just working. And that's just kind of like, you know, a broad stroked bit of information a lot of information that his son told me. He also had said, you know, had it not been for the Black nurses, none of this would have been possible. This meaning Seaview remaining open, the wards running for decades, and the isoniazid trials that took place there. So I think that's, I don't know if that answered the question fully or, you know, I mean, there's so much that I could say about him because I became close to his son and I loved listening to the stories about his father, these little anecdotes of how he didn't like the cold. You know, once he retired, he moved to Baltimore, actually. Yeah, and that's where he died. And then they brought him back to the cemetery in New York. You know, how he treated the nurses. He was always on their side. He wrote recommendations for them. He was their champion. His son told me one time that he put them in a car. It probably was like, he said 1949. And he said, we're going down south. And his son was like, why, Dad? And he said, because I want to show you what's happening down south. And he took him down south so he could see firsthand the Jim Crowism that, you know, these nurses faced, and he drove up. So he was a very ethical man. He really connected with these nurses in a way that was different than other people. He didn't breeze by them. He acknowledged them as human beings. And you can see that in his records, these meticulous records that came from the nurses, but he kept extraordinary records of each trial patient.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So many thoughts on that. We do have a couple questions in the chat, but I do want to just ask one question of Miss Virginia before we get to the questions in the chat, because Maria sharing about when the cure broke, So, Miss Virginia, were you there at that moment? Can you describe what the energy like, what the feelings were like? You're on mute, Miss Virginia.
Very high energy. Everyone was happy. It was a joyous time. It was really, the patients felt good that they were able to go home and be treated. They didn't have to stay in the hospital setting. So it was very joyous.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. So get into the questions in the chat. The first one is Gabriel. I can imagine in writing and researching something like this, there are a lot of exciting finds. What was the thing / person / other you were most excited to find when you were working on this book?
Wow, that question is extraordinary. And there were so many amazing things. Obviously, Miss Virginia was like the gold mine find, but I'm going to say it had to do with a trial patient. And I'm going to say this story because it speaks to tuberculosis, particularly because we just, World Tuberculosis Day was a few days ago, and I was engaged in this conversation about stigma surrounding the disease and how the stigma has not gone away in today's world. When the book came out in September, it came out on September 19th. It was the week of the high-level TB meeting at the UN, and I had the opportunity to sit on an authors panel with John Green, Vidya Krishnan, who wrote The Phantom Plague, and a woman named Handa, who was the UN, she was the keynote speaker. She came from Mongolia, and she had TB 10 years ago, and she told her story of how she was stigmatized. And the first thing they told her was, don't tell anyone you can't get married. When I was researching the book, I took Robotech's records, I looked at the trial patients, and I started trying to see if anyone was alive. And I went out to Spokio, whatever you find. And I called this woman, Milagros Delfas. And she picked up the phone, and I said, hi, may I speak to Milagros? Who is this? I said, my name is Maria. I found your name on a list of patients who were part of the Isoniazid trials. She hung up the phone. I called back. She hung up the phone again. I called back. Then her daughter called me. I said, who is this? And I explained who it was. And she said, tuberculosis. My mother didn't have tuberculosis. And I said, well, sorry, I think she did. Her name is on this list of patients. She was at Seaview Hospital. Here are the dates. I can even tell you the dosage of medication she received. She said, I'll call you back. A day later, she called me back and she said, I'm so sorry. My mother has carried this stigma around. Now she's nervous. She was 90 years old. She carried it for 70 years. She told no one in her family. And she said, please don't let anyone know. Please don't let the reporter tell anyone, because I'm going to go to my knitting group and they're going to run away from me and think I'm going to make them sick. And so the reason I'm saying this story is because she carried a stigma for 70 years, told no one in her family. The only people that knew were her sisters, because she had come up from Puerto Rico and was living with them when she got sick. Not her husband, not her daughters, not a friend. And she had begged me not to use her name. And before she died, she told her daughter, please let her use my name. I feel like I've unburdened something. And so that, for me, was a moment of both like, oh my God, I let the cat out of the bag. And oh my God, this disease is a scarlet letter. And so, and it continues to this day in the story of Handa, which is why I said that. It is no different for women who were considered polluted and unmarriable. So I think that was one of the most astonishing moments for me, because also I felt like I was ruining this woman's life at 90 years old. She was afraid to go to her knitting group where they knit hats for babies in hospital.
Oh my gosh, unbelievable. And we actually had the opportunity to host the daughter at one of our webinars.
Yes.
And it was just amazing to connect with her and just have that piece at the end for her mom to be able to share, like, yes, please share my story. So going back to the chat, Gabriel again, one of the stories that I found most touching was that of Elke. I love the chapter 10, the thoracoplasty. Can you talk a bit about how you got to that story?
Okay, so that is based on a real patient. So Seaview has autopsy reports. You can look at them. There's a and I say museum because it's kind of become a warehouse now since COVID. But there are autopsy books, and LP was a real patient. That is what happened to her. How did I describe the thoracoplasty? Because I have a crazy friend who decided. I said to her, hey, I need to know how to describe a thoracoplasty, and these medical texts are not doing it for me. And I found this thing from the British Medical Journal, British Medical Hospital from 1925 on YouTube. It's a half an hour with a Friday night. She's like, let's open a bottle of wine. And so that's what we did. We watched the thoracoplasty operation step by step. And I was like, okay, they're making an incision. They're cutting it around the shoulder blade. So that whole thing came from an actual 1925 operation. And that's how I described it, because I wanted the details not only to fit, the science had to fit, but I wanted to have people go into that operating room where Edna, Miss Virginia's aunt, saw these operations that Dr. Robichek described as butchery. He said that people were carved up in all sorts of ways, like 18-inch incisions, removing, 8 to 9 ribs. And that's how that story came about. But a lot of that is also from the autopsy report of like what happened to her and how she ended up dying because she got an infection, which was, again, this was what they risked when, Miss Virginia's aunt. There were no drugs, and the nurses got blamed for it. They were called saboteurs. It was their fault. That was the most shocking part. Somehow or another, it became the fault of the nurses. They either didn't clean a glove properly. So, yeah.
Wow. Miss Virginia, go ahead.
When I left Seaview Hospital, I went to Brooklyn Jewish Hospital to work in the operating room. And one of my specialties was chest surgery, thoracic surgery. And it was fascinating. I enjoyed working in the operating room because it's a fast pace. You have to be on your toes every moment, and you have to know the surgeon. And my last job was working in the operating room here on Staten Island. I got tired of commuting at Staten Island University Hospital, and I worked in thoracic surgery there as well. So I know what you're talking about. By the time I stopped working in 1995, the incision was about 4 inches, not 18 inches. They had changed their mode of surgery.
That's good.
Awesome. It sounds like we need to make you an honorary chest member, Miss Virginia.
I never told you that before.
No, that's awesome.
Things come back to me as I'm listening and talking.
Absolutely. We love to hear it. So still sticking with the chat, my mentor, NECA, I love everything about this book and the stories of the people in it. I would like to know how connected are you to both the descendants of the Black angels that are around today, and how did you react to these stories being told?
Thanks for that question. I have become extremely connected. They text me. They have like my family. They really have become like my family. They call me to tell me, their doctor's appointments. They're wonderful. They're all wonderful. They have been so gracious to let me into their lives. I say this again and again. Regarding the stories, it took a long time. When I first approached them, I asked them to tell me very painful things about the lives of their loved ones. And it took a while to trust. So as I say, I just shut up and listened for a long time. I just listened to what they were telling me. Didn't respond. If I went back with more questions, I said to them, I have more questions. Sometimes they would answer. Sometimes they took a long time, especially when I would ask them to recall the memories of being down in the South. And to the almost 3 days before the manuscript was going to be, I couldn't touch it anymore. I was actually texting them and saying, are you sure this happened? Are you sure she used to paint her nails? Are you? And they were so kind. They answered hundreds of questions. I mean, you can ask Miss Virginia. I would pester her with like, can you tell me what your Aunt Edna, how she walked, how she talked, the sound of her voice? Like, I wanted every single detail to make a person come alive, because the way they walk, the way they talk, the way they move through the world is what makes them a not composite figure. So it took them a while. And once we got to that place where they understood they could trust me, magic happened. It was for the first time they told me, thank you, I feel like my loved one is being seen. Thank you, nobody ever asked about their story. Nobody cared about their story. And so I felt really, really grateful. And to this day, I do. I still can't believe, 9 years later, how it unfolded. So I hope that answers your question about the connection that I have with them. They also saw my daughter grow up. She was 4 and now she's like 13. So they're like, how's it being a mom to a teenager? I'm like, oh God, you want her? And they're like, no. But yeah, it's been wonderful. It's been a wonderful experience to be in their lives in a very ordinary way now, you know?
I love that your daughter has a whole host of Black aunties.
She does. She totally does. I took her to church. They invited me to the St. Philip's Baptist Church. And I said, I grew up with a grandmother, a Greek Orthodox, who would drag me to church. And it was all about like these deep, like Gregorian lamentations where I'd walk out and I was like, oh my God, I don't want to see anybody. And then I went to St. Philip's Baptist Church and I was like, I would totally go to church. It was uplifting. It was beautiful. I walked out of there feeling like, wow, this is church, not like those like horrible, like, you're going to be smite if you don't. But anyway, it was great. And she was so excited. She's like, let's go back.
I love that for y'all.
I was so thrilled.
Miss Virginia?
I spoke at Grace's class several years, telling them about my history.
They loved it.
Questions. They were delightful.
Oh man, I love that. All right, so we're still in the chat. The chat's popping now. Second question. I really appreciate the parallel story about the Black experience with racism in medicine, both at the hospital level and nationally. Can you tell us a little bit about how you decided to weave that work, which feels like a book within itself, into this story?
Yeah, the book couldn't have been written without the story, without that story. It was all, when I started to dig into it, and I'm not a nurse, but when I started to dig into the history of nursing, especially the history of New York City, you couldn't divorce the story. That had to be part of it, because these nurses were advocating for the integration into the American Nurses Association. And Masuria, one of the main nurses in the book, comes up from Howard University to be with, Stoppers, who's head of the National Association of Colored Nurses. And she wants to advocate on the front lines. She's like, this is why I'm coming up, because I want to work for the integration of nurses. So it couldn't have, the story would have been just this, again, sentimentalized, very pretty version of a bunch of, Black nurses who answered a call and came up. There was no taking it apart. And it was part of the history of New York. That was the other thing. Like, this is a New York story, and that part of New York history is never talked about. People are stunned that there were segregated hospitals, and they weren't segregated the same way the South was. Masuria's family said to me, she said, her niece said to me, my aunt always said, when I went down South, I knew where I belonged. Here in the North, I thought I belonged somewhere, and I didn't, because there was no sign telling me I don't belong there. And so it was really, it had to be, and I will just say this, the line that was like, I knew from the beginning, but I came across a line at one point where there was a nurse advocate, Celeria Key, there was a meeting with the president of hospitals, and there were 300 people there, and they wanted to hold the meeting because people wanted to know why the Black nurses couldn't work at other hospitals. And she said to him, "Why do you send Black nurses to Seaview?" And in front of 300 people, he said, "We send Black nurses to Seaview because, quote, in 20 years, we won't have a colored problem in America because they'll all be dead from tuberculosis." And so I couldn't write a book without that race part. It was, in a way saying, we are going to kill all the women, so the entire Black race doesn't exist anymore. And there was also the racism against the immigrants, who were coming in from from other countries into the United States. They were considered uncultured, immoral, uncouth, and they were not American. And so they needed to be sent to die, and the nurses were sent to die, and they didn't die. That's the best part of the story. They don't die. So.
Amazing. So there is another question in the chat. So what is at Seaview now? It sounds like some buildings are still lived in, but others are sort of receding into nature. Miss Virginia, you want to share about that?
Yes, there are some buildings that are receding into nature, but they can't be touched. 4 pavilions were taken down to build the Robotech Center, which is a skilled nursing care facility, a trauma facility. And some of the buildings have been rehabbed, like the Staten Island Ballet, where I serve on the board. That was the laboratory. And when I walk through some of the rooms there, it reminds me of when it was a laboratory, but it's lovely. It's a studio for ballet. Camelot has 2 buildings here, one for females and one for males, recovering drug addicts. And the theater is, one of the churches is being used as a theater. Colonnade Hall was renovated, and it's used as a catering hall. That's where the patients used to go for their occupational therapy, where they did the weaving of the chairs. They did a lot of repair work. And of course, the farm was across the street. Farm Colony was a farm that supplied the hospital with food and, of course, meat, dairy. Farm Colony has a ballpark. And, of course, they can't tear down the entrance building. So it's just sitting there deteriorating. And the kids are putting graffiti all over it. But we don't have graffiti on this side.
Nice. I did put a video in the chat that has a drone aerial video of the Seaview grounds if you're interested in checking that out. So a couple more questions. Maria, okay, here's another question. Another quick question. The discussion about how the Nazi POWs were treated in America and the sense of freedom they had as a direct result of being white in America was something I never knew. How did you find out about these stories and how the Black angels still had to treat them with respect when they were so terrible to them as humans? I also love the adding of boxing championship story as its connection to the fight for equality in America.
So those 2 questions are, they fold into each other. The nurses, they loved sports and they loved boxing. And at the time, Joe Louis going against Max Schmeling was supposed to be like the thing that was going to lift America and show that, this Nazi fascist country, that America was better. But for the Black community, his win was another hope that if he won, the Black people would be seen as equal in the United States. And so that's what the importance of that was. And that is connected to the story of the POW. For those who have not read the book, Black nurses during World War II could not serve on the front lines. So they were dispersed throughout America to these Nazi POW camps. There were hundreds of them across America, where these POWs, some of them were really, really like high level, they were dangerous. They lived in a manner that was incredible. They had white tablecloths, they had wine decanters on the table, they were given privileges, they started working in farms, they were allowed to roam in the towns, they ate at the white counters, and these Black nurses were tasked to take care of them. One of them appears at Seaview because a few miles from Seaview was Halloran Hospital, and he gets put on the ward, and he hates Missouri, and he wants her to die. And so she spends 8 months taking care of him. And the men's ward was a bawdy place, as it was described. But the thing about that story that was so striking is that here was a man who was the most reviled human being in the United States, a Nazi POW, and he finds the one person that the country considers less than him, his Black nurse. And nobody comes to her rescue, and she's tasked for 8 months to take care of him until one day he turns and he spits on her, and he tells her, "I hope you die," because he wants to infect her with tuberculosis. And so that story bleeds into the Max Schmeling story, because his first time out in Yankee Stadium, he loses, and he loses against this German superpower. And then he comes back, and there's the second fight where he's successful, but nothing changes for Black America. It's not that victory that they're hoping for, in the same way that the victory of Missouri taking care of him, nothing happens. They don't give her any accolades for it. She just keeps going to work because she doesn't have a choice. Black women didn't have a choice. That was it. She had to go to work. And the family told me that. So there was that story came from the family, and it was corroborated by somebody else who had worked alongside of her, the Nazi POW. And then there was a newspaper article about a Nazi POW that escaped the hospital at the same time. Not Seaview, Halloran Hospital. And that's how the city found out that they were housing POWs at Seaview and Halloran, because they shut down all the ports.
Unbelievable. The evil that people exhibit in the midst of sickness is just unreal and still alive, unfortunately. There's a couple more questions. I don't know if Maria or Miss Virginia, you would know this one. Were streptomycin injections used during the 1940s at Seaview?
Yes, it was used extensively. I shared with Maria a diary that I got from one of the patients whose mother was a patient here as well. And her mother documented every time she received an injection. It was beautifully written and preserved by her daughter. Holder was her last name.
It was used also not only extensively, but it was also, I found this book from this doctor who was a pediatrician who discovered a way to atomize it, and have it inhaled for children. So they didn't have to do those painful injections. And his name eluded me right now. But so yes, it was used.
Awesome. And this question's for you, Miss Virginia. Can you tell us about what it was like when Maria called you or got in contact with you for the first time? Was it surprising to you that she was seeking you out after all these years?
Well, I met Maria at the Staten Island Museum, where the exhibit is now of the Black Angels, the nurses who help cure tuberculosis. And then Maria and I met numerous times at Harlem Hospital. There was a little cafe there. It's not there anymore. But we met there frequently and we talked. And I decided it was a good idea. The nurses who worked here deserve to be remembered and their legacy preserved in words. So Maria and I became very good friends. I introduced her to many people, Missouri Walker's nieces, grandnieces. and others. And of course, some people did not appear in the book, Maria. I don't know if I mentioned this to you. They're descendants, but I told them, you don't have anything to do with that. Your editor decided who they wanted to put in the book. My Aunt Edna Sutton Ballard was one of them. Americus was a registered nurse also. Americus Sutton, my other aunt, who lived with my aunt until she passed. And then she went to live with her sister in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. They were very close-knit family. And Maria went with me to Pittsburgh to meet my cousin Salahuddin, who was a freedom rider and very, very active in the community. And of course, his mother was mentioned also, Mary House, my aunt, my mother's sister.
It was a difficult decision to who to put in and who to put out. The book had, there's the same amount of pages in the book is on the cutting room floor. And that came not just from the story of the nurses, but also the story of the doctors, like that race for the cure, where it began in Germany with Dr. Domak and Prontosil and Contaban, and then it moved all the way, to the story of what happened when, they didn't want to talk about it here. All of that was pared down. Even the story with Dr. Waxman and Schatz, the original manuscript had more of that tiff between graduate student and professor. And it got pared down because I wanted the story of the nurses to drive the narrative, because it was about them. And so when Robotchek comes in, I think it's like page 107, I decided the story has to really focus on him because he's the second driving force in this narrative. And so it was unfortunate because there were so many great stories that were told, but it's also the two nurses I picked. Obviously, I knew so much about Edna because of Miss Virginia and her son, but also she was one of the first to come up very, very, very early on. And then Missouriya was just this ferocious advocate, and she was so in your face about, I am going to change history. That's what she wanted to do as a little girl. Her family said from a little girl, she said, I want to change history. And she did. I do want to just mention something because, Miss Virginia talked about coming up at 16 years old. And it's so shocking to think of a 16-year-old doing this. And I just want to acknowledge that because, I think of my daughter and I think of her friends who have sisters at 16, and these kids could barely take care of their dogs. And it's just such a extraordinary thing that we relied on this labor to send a young girl into an infectious disease ward with children. And she rose to the occasion, and it's just extraordinary to me, but it ties into the type of systemic issues we have today, not necessarily in hospitals because there's laws against sending a 16-year-old, but people who work in fast food restaurants, people who are underpaid, young people who are sent out to work. And her story is so layered because of that. Yes, it's extraordinary, but it's also a lesson in history that not much has changed. When we look at young people who are working today and they're undervalued and underpaid and their lives are being risked. People say, oh, how are your lives being risked at McDonald's? Well, it is. People are getting beat up all the time in these places for no reason at all. And so I just wanted to highlight that because it's something that again and again strikes me. And when she talked about it earlier, it came in, but it's such an amazing thing to think about, the history from then to now and how it can be used as an agent for change in many ways. I mean, the story can be, I think, but her story. So I just wanted to acknowledge that part of,
I wanted to
this team.
I wanted to add to that, Maria. I was a babysitter for my two younger brothers. So I had a lot of experience with younger population. They were 2 and 4 years younger than I. And of course, you grow up very quickly. During that time, 16 and 14 and 12, a lot of people were working.
Yeah, I totally, it was a different time, but 16 is still 16, you know, and I get that 16 after the Depression and the World War II were different than 16 now. I don't know about that because the pandemic was pretty tough on a lot of kids too, so I don't want to assume that. But the resonance of a 16-year-old in an infectious disease ward, I think that's what it is with no cure, you know.
But I had such good training from those Black nurses that I'm still here, and
Yes.
I have nothing wrong with me.
Thankfully.
I adhered to the teachings of those nurses who were in education, and it gave me a platform to work from for the rest of my life.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very good foundation.
And that's the other part of the story, that they triumph, right? And the story is a story of triumph. It's a story of people who show us that there is good and humanity in the world. Somebody wrote me an email yesterday and they said to me, I read this story and I'm so depressed about everything that's going on in the world, but I feel like there's good people and there's hope. And I was so happy to receive this message yesterday because, you know, it is a story of triumph. We saw it. We saw it with COVID, and we'll probably see it again. Anytime there's problems, there's always these, you know, handful of human beings who are willing to just step in and take care of us. And that's what I was getting at with the 16-year-old. Like, you just stepped in at 16 and said, I'm going to do this. And you did it, and you were diligent in what you did, you know, and they were diligent in teaching you. And so, you know, I always say this again and again, you know, Dr. McCamey has heard it. I thank everybody who's out there taking care of people like me. You know, all of you surgeons and doctors and nurses, thank you.
And I think that's a great segue because our time is coming to a close. We've got 2 minutes left. So, Miss Virginia, I would love for you to impart us some words on how you would love us to remember the work of the Black Angels. And if you had one thing to pick that you would want to leave everyone to leave from this fireside chat as inspiration, word of encouragement, however the energy sees fit for you to share a piece of your wisdom, we would love to end with that.
Well, I've always said nurses are special people. And you really can't be a good nurse unless you have integrity, you have a feeling for others, you know how to soothe the patient or the person and make them feel comfortable and at ease. So I would say, just be a good nurse and do what you know is right. I did have a few words written down, but I feel more emotional about it because I'm glad that I was able to give my patients comfort, compassion, and I was very happy being a nurse. I was asked if I had it to do all over again, and I've done many jobs, I would choose nursing. And thank you, Maria, for writing the book. I think these nurses deserve to be remembered.
They do.
I'm speaking for many nurses who went on before me. I stand on their shoulders. And I'm
Amazing.
proud to be one of them and honored.
And with that, thank you all for joining us for our fireside chat sponsored by Women in Chest Medicine Interest Group. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.